Hey, Joe. Nice to have you in the podcast. We're going to touch some interesting topic about observability and user observability and system observability. Interestingly enough, you're one of the unique person that come with a background in both angles. Previously, you were working on the system observability with Dynatrace and Datadog, and now you're working at Glassbox. And this is more of it's the user observability side, which is exactly the topic that I think the industry in that area is kind of touching about. What is the future of observability in general? How do they will they merge? How does the AI really impact those systems? From your previous experience, from the current experience, and obviously there's a lot of AI impact into that industry right now, which is going quite through a huge disruption, I would say, as many other part of our industry. So without further ado, I'll let you introduce yourself and touch your both observability background and Glassbox background.
Sounds good. Thank you, Nati, and thank you for having me here. Yeah, just I'm the head of the solutions engineering team here at Glassbox. I've been working here for about 8 years. My background it's more of a financial institution observability background. Throughout my history, I've worked as the manager for observability enterprise monitoring at Morgan Stanley, Citi, and a consultant. I had my own business doing consulting for observability and monitoring. So I have a passion of making sure that our systems are available for our customers, so that they can have a great experience. And that kind of led me to Glassbox. So Glassbox is a tool that monitors the user's experience, and helps you to understand their behaviors, their struggles, their abandonments, and gives you that context so that you can address the user's challenges and also help to even personalize the user's content in the way that the user really wants to receive it. I really have a great time working here. Pleasure working with a lot of large financial institutions, helping them to understand how the users are interacting and improving that interaction over time.
Perfect. So this is a good segue for our discussion. So just to summarize, it's kind of a 17 years, I believe, watching servers, and now 8 years watching humans. Is that
Yeah,
a good
yeah.
summary?
You're aging me, Natty, but that's correct.
You don't want to start because if I'll need to talk about my age, this will be different. Anyway, going to the first observability kind of background, and I'll try to understand from you from that history days to the current days. What is the actual area where you experienced a blind spot, meaning that all the screen were green, but there was an issue that was hiding because it wasn't really monitored well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So back when I was monitoring enterprise monitoring end to end, we would have a lot of agents looking at, CPU memory disk utilization, monitoring for certain thresholds, and everything would be fine. But we would get, we'd have remediation and playbooks to resolve problems and things like that. That's great. But we kept getting bad feedback from our surveys from our customers. We'd just send out sample surveys. The customer said, "Hey, this application is slow. I can't figure things out. I can't complete certain tasks. I'm having issues with login." And then, so that was a big blind spot for us. And so we said, let's get a little closer to the customer, and we started with what's called end user monitoring. So we had sample probes that would go out and simulate user sessions. So using scripts that will go out and log in, bring up account summaries and log out, and just make sure that those flows would work. Well, that was okay too, but it didn't cover all of the flows that a customer would do. When we get feedback from customers, we say, "How in the world did they get down this path?" This is not a path that we would typically expect. So we didn't have monitoring and observability on those certain paths. So then the next evolution was to do real user monitoring, monitoring the user's behaviors, monitoring the why behind the what. So we could see the numbers, but we didn't understand why users were abandoning certain flows. So that got us into looking at things like struggles. That got us looking into things like accessibility issues, things that just we didn't even conceive of until we really sat in the customer's shoes and really observed it from their behavior. And as you can imagine, when I was working at the banks, we'd have millions and millions and millions of sessions per month. So how do we digest all of that data? And that's where Glassbox comes in and helps using AI to digest the data, to look at certain patterns, look at certain signals and the behavior. For example, we had some customers that that weren't completing and onboarding a loan application flow. And, with our A/B tools, with some of the observability tools that we were looking at, we were just thinking that, oh, maybe they just didn't want to complete this loan. Maybe they made a decision that, this wasn't for them. But when we dug a little deeper and look at things from a behavior standpoint, we start seeing things like form validation errors. We start seeing things where people were clicking on, areas on the screen that were considered dead clicks. And then we started understanding that there may be something about our UI that we think is okay, but the customer is not resonating with that well. And again, that was kind of a needle in the haystack. There was two groups of users. One that were submitting applications that had a phone number that was different from what we were expecting. There were some users from a different country that were trying to submit their application, and we had a certain length of characters for this phone number field. Those users weren't able to onboard. We also had some folks that we ultimately observed had some accessibility issues. They were using screen readers, and we labeled a button incorrectly, and their screen readers were click on a certain area of the screen. It wasn't clickable, right? That area of the screen reader thought that that was an interactive button, but it really wasn't. So, again, those were needles in the haystack that prevented some of our conversions. And again, if we were just looking at the numbers, we would just say, oh, maybe these people were just messing around on our site, or maybe these people were just testing. We couldn't find it. But by using real user monitoring, using tools like Glassbox, and then combining that with AI to see those signals, those needles in the haystack, we're able to address those issues and help those customers improve their.
Perfect. Let's talk about your previous kind of state where you're monitoring servers. How is that different than monitoring servers? And what is the actual setup of monitoring infrastructure and trying to understand what's going on? Why is it different?
Yeah, so with infrastructure, it's really helpful to kind of see up and down. So we look at that from a standpoint of like availability and then also performance. So we want to make sure that the system is performing within certain guidelines, response time is quick, and things like that. So you have different components within the backend that will help with that. So when I set up as observability, I looked at the different layers of the application of the infrastructure, and we make sure that we had monitors on all of that. So from the networking, from the ALB to the web servers, to the microservices, to the databases, to the underlying infrastructure that supported that, we had check marks on all of that, which was super helpful. Lots of information. And sometimes it would get to the point where, we would run after issues that may not have any impact on the customer. The customers don't care. Our scalability was huge, right?
In general, on that context, you're basically saying the experience is we have sensors almost everywhere on the infrastructure
Yeah.
side, right?
Yeah.
So on the network, you said databases, microservices, everything. Then you collect the data so to some sort of a data lake,
Yeah.
and then you observe it continuously 24 by 7, only for the case in which if there is a fault, something will come up. And then you'll be able
Exactly.
to do the triage to actually see it. Now, that means almost by definition that most of the data that you're collecting is not really used because it's
That's
monitoring a
true.
healthy system, right? And in some cases, as you said in the beginning, when you talked about cases where everything looks green, but there was an issue because it didn't have the right sensors or set up or something like that.
100%.
Okay, got it. So back to the discussion. We're talking about the practices of how observability works. Talk about the fact that you need to put sensors everywhere, network, storage, microservices, all the things that you just described. Then we have a dashboard that human monitors. And usually, because you need to find, as you said, the needle in a haystack, the work of organizing this data into something that will observe the right thing at the right time, that's been the main work of SREs in those organizations, and trying to continuously improve that and work on that. But we also touch on the fact that most of this data is monitoring healthy system most of the time.
Yeah.
And we're doing it only for the case in which something will go wrong. We'll have the data available for us to do the triage and investigate it. And you also mentioned at the beginning that it didn't really necessarily create cases where screen will show green and you still have a fault that you didn't detect it because you had some sort of a blind spot on that. How much people, and you specifically from your experience, are happy about this practice, how much they're frustrated about it, how much they want to change that, and we'll soon get into the AI kind of world, but just wanted to hear about the experience itself because you've been seeing customers, and that's why it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, it can be very, very frustrating when, everything, like you said, looks green, but the customers are complaining. And sometimes you don't know that the customers are having a bad experience until you get a bad survey. I mean, maybe one, maybe 5 out of 100 will respond to a survey. When I worked at Glassbox, I used to talk to a lot of different leaders, and one CXO said that, "Hey, Joe, what keeps me up at night are those customers that have a bad experience, but they never tell us. They just silently kind of fade away." Those are the things that keeps us, kind of on our toes and saying, how can we how can we get better? How can we make sure that we're not seeing those gaps, or make sure that we're addressing those gaps, so that customers consistently have a good experience. The other side to that is that, again, collecting a lot of data, and then constantly kind of looking for thresholds and things like that sometimes that could be a waste of resources on, from an employee side. So we had a ton of people kind of looking at eyes on glass, monitoring for alerts, looking at those traffic red, yellow, green signals and things like that, making sure that everything is okay. And again, that becomes a waste of resources as well. And
And
then
the main measure for SREs is called MTTR. Can you elaborate a little bit about what that MTTR means and why is that an important measure for SRE?
Yeah, absolutely. So mean time to repair, to resolve an issue, being able to have the accurate amount of observability and monitoring in place to get to the root cause quickly is super, super important. I mean, I remember this is a long time ago. There were some times where we would spend hours triaging a problem, high CPU. And why did we have high CPU? We'll start going back and say, hey, the first thing we'll say, hey, what changed? And again, there could be a ton of code on a release weekend that may have impacted things. And so, looking at the application, trying to resolve, like, why did this application have a problem? A lot of times the developers and the product managers didn't want to roll back because they had new features that were going to help with increase of revenue and things like that. Things tested well in UAT, but now that they got into prod, we're having some CPU problems. So we'll throw more hardware at it. And we kind of mask the problem, but we never really get to the core. And that again, that increases the amount of time to getting to the root cause.
Let's kind of double click on that. So you're saying that the the MTTR is the main measure for SRE, right? It's to keep the system
It
up
is.
and running and whatever. On the other side, you said that to get the low MTTR, you need to be able to find the root cause fast, but the data that you need to find the MTTR sits in different places, meaning different screens, not necessarily just observability. Sometimes it's an application thing. Sometimes it sits in a different system, and navigating through all of that. That's what makes the job hard to understand what is the root cause, right? So
Exactly.
the first thing is that you're collecting a lot of data. Now you need to find a needle in a haystack. That's one problem. The second problem is that the data is not contextual. Therefore, you are the context. So you
Right.
basically, the human is the context, and the human needs to now navigate through the pile of information and understand and connect the dots, and
Yeah,
basically build the right information about the user and the application. And in many cases, and correct me if I'm wrong, most observability are relatively blind to the application topology or dependencies of all other systems. So it will have hard time to distinguish between the symptoms and the root cause, right? And that's kind of one of the main problems why it takes a lot of time to do this type of deep investigation around that.
that's true. There,
Is
and
that
one
is
other
that the experience? Yeah, go
That
ahead.
is experience, and then there's a gap between the knowledge sometimes of the SRE and the developer, and that's another challenge. Maybe the developer has developed code that maybe uses more resources in this new release than the last. Again, we test a lot of through UAT, but then when you get the real traffic of production, you have an SRE looking at things like infrastructure, looking at the platform, and trying to maintain that, and then you have the code from the developer developer, and there's sometimes there's not a smooth overlap between the two. So
Interesting.
again,
So you're saying there's silos as well, right? So there's
there's silos.
SRE watching for the system availability. There's developers who is pushing code into that, not necessarily, kind of thinking about availability as the main thing because they're more incentivized, as you said earlier, to push new features into production, or especially if they have an ROI associated with that or a cost saving associated with that, or important user experience around that. And that becomes kind of even a conflict of interest from that respect.
Exactly.
And also from not just that we have those silos within the organization itself, the tooling and the experience is very different, right? What developers see, what the SRE is seeing is not necessarily the same system, and they're
Exactly.
watching different things. And
Exactly.
therefore, there is even a language barrier between the two.
100%. Yeah, exactly. That sometimes increases the MTTR as well. So I mean, in terms trying to SRE, like you said, just looking at this thing from with an SRE lens, developers may look for it, and the developers it may take time for the developers to get involved, and they look at it from their perspective. Having that bridge and building that bridge and making sure that you have that breaking down those silos to have that communication. If that's not smooth, then the MTTR goes up because they're
Perfect.
both.
So
Yeah,
I'll just summarize again what we just said. So first of
yeah,
all, we said in order for observability to work, at least in the current world, we have to have sensors everywhere connected to some sort of a cloud, then build some sort of dashboard, and then SREs is doing the triage to find the root cause.
right,
The second thing that we said is that there is a couple of challenges on how that process works today. One of the challenges is the needle in a haystack, meaning there's a lot of information that I need to navigate through in order to find the root cause. The second problem that we said is the fact that in many cases, the problem sits in different places, in different
yeah,
systems, not necessarily just the observability system, and therefore the triage can be much more complex because now an I'm as a person becomes a context that needs to connect all those things into one place and help to triage it. The third problem that we said is the organization challenge, right? The building silos between developers and SREs that are not necessarily using the same tools, not necessarily have the same incentive even, or in many cases conflicting incentives. I also wanted to discuss what do customers think about that? And if you have a specific let's talk about a specific example in that area where um, to actually find a root cause, you had to go through more than one system, or it was you had all the monitoring possible, but the actual problem was alerted somewhere else. Did you remember any case like that?
yeah. A few cases like that. So, for example, we have a database. It's just that's super slow. Well, first of all, it got to the point where the users were saying, "Hey, I'm making a request to the system. It's taking forever to get that response back. I'm not getting a response." And so, um, again, it wasn't to the point where CPU was extremely high, but or memory utilization was really high. Those basic metrics were okay, but again, it was the users were complaining, so we had to troubleshoot from where the users were, looking at the requests that were being made, and then taking it back and finding out where that root cause was. And so what we found was that, the system that they were requesting data was from, that seemed to be fine, but the upstream systems, we had some issues with the gateways that were in front of those systems that were kind of, were at fault. Um, there was
So
CPU.
this is more of a example of a case which is kind of ambiguous, meaning that
Yeah.
it's not clear failure, and therefore you need both the user experience plus the observability to connect the dots to understand. Maybe you're not seeing a very high latency, but it's enough to cause the user to, let's say, abandon the application and not continue with the journey and things of that line, where you have the two system not connecting, or even a different organization, people in organization now. What is the impact of MTTR? We talked about MTTR. When there's a failure, what is the impact on some of the organization that you're saying? People may hear, mean them to solve the problem,
Yeah.
but they don't necessarily understand the cost aspect of not having the system up.
Yeah, it's a good point. So the ultimately, the cost of that is the downstream costs of high MTTR. One, you're spending a lot of time with your SREs, your developers, troubleshooting a problem, and again, finding that needle in the haystack. It takes a lot of resources, and at the same time, your customers wind up suffering. You start getting bad reviews, you start getting retention issues with the customer. You start losing a lot of revenue because they aren't able to complete certain flows. So all of those things, that one metric, the MTTR, is critical to helping you to understand. Hey, you know. How can I getting my users back on track so that they can do the things that they were expecting to do, and also keeping our revenue streams going forward. And then the customer sentiment. Sometimes the customer has a certain tolerance for failures, right? But then after a while, it's just like, I can't, every time if I go in and I'm not able to do my basic functionality, if I'm not able to log in, if I'm not able to bring up accounts, I'm not able to check out. That becomes a bad kind of look on the overall application and the company, and it goes back to that CXO that says, hey, my greatest fear is when customers have a bad experience, they don't tell us about it, and they just kind of slowly drift away and maybe go to a competitor. So again, that
Perfect.
one metric, MTTR, and in today's age, the tolerance for slow response or for down is beginning really low. I look at my kids, and if the internet is down for just a few minutes, they lose it. I'm like,
Yeah,
God,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
there was a time
exactly.
where we
I have
didn't
the
have.
same experience myself, and just actually building on that. Now,
Yeah,
we're all talking about AI right now, right? So we kind of taking a segue towards the AI world. Ideally, people would think that okay, we have AI. We built in an AI agent on top of observability, and a lot of the problem that we just discussed goes away. The agent can read the data in a much more intelligent way. It could do a lot of the triage or help with the triage. Um, it could potentially even do root cause analysis around that. Um, and we're seeing, kind of companies like Dynatrace and Datadog, not surprisingly, announcing now that they're adding features in that area. There's a clear demand for that because of the issue that we just discussed
yeah.
early on. I think the entire industry is now realizing that they want to move to a more autonomous system. Um, how much do you see customer adopting this? How much do you see that approach working? What is the gap with that approach? If you could kind of touch on based on what you know or hear
Yeah.
from your journey.
A lot of our customers actually have a mandate to use AI in their day-to-day world. And when I say customers, there's companies that we work with. That those are our customers. So when we're working with our large banks and retail customers, they are saying that we have a mandate to be more efficient, to start using AI. So that's one. I think that's great. I think AI is great at being able to help us be more efficient, to be able to resolve problems, to find those needles in the haystack, to find those patterns in the challenges, in the challenges that the users are facing, and then get to a root cause faster. Super great. I think at the same time, we have to make sure that we don't rest on our laurels and just let AI run the show. We have to monitor the babysitter, right? So if we have AI kind of interacting with our end users through chat. It's great for efficiency. Brings down the first call resolution, average call handling time with from our data centers. But at the same time, just like with my two kids, I trust the babysitter, but I still need to monitor what's happening. There's times where the kids start repeating something that the babysitter was saying to her friend on the phone, and I was like, "Where did you learn that from?" And the kid's like, "Well, such and such taught me." And the same thing with our customers. Our customers could be getting answers. The AI is super happy about giving an answer. Is that always the correct answer, though? And our customers will take that response and then run with it, but is it the right one? So being able to monitor that, being able to train our AI to make sure it's doing the right, giving the right responses is super important. Also, making sure that we don't lose the empathy with our customers. Right? There are some times where a customer just wants to hear from us. They're my I have some elderly neighbors that had some trouble logging in to their bank, and they call me, "Hey Joe, can you come down to my house and help me see?" And when they called in to the bank, they didn't get a live person. It seemed like the bank did its best to avoid
Oh
having
yeah,
to.
I had a lot of experience with that
Yeah,
recently, even with support of Apple and other things. Uh,
yeah,
Touching on that, actually, on trusting the agent on doing
yes,
stuff. Let's say that I have a autonomous car. I'd use the autonomous car example, and it's 90% accurate. And let's see how much we're going to trust it. If I would say, what does 90% accuracy means? It means that out of 10 traffic light, it will identify 9, but it will miss 1.
right.
Would you trust it?
I would not.
Exactly. So
Yeah,
90% may be misleading in this world. If it's not 100%, you cannot trust it. And that's the key thing. It has to be 100% accurate to actually trust it. And we've seen that experience also with Cloud Code, right? Before that, we have assisted kind of coding. The problem with assisted coding is that it still requires an intervention, and therefore requires a lot of our attention because now I need to have more verification, right? It
right.
produces much more code, much faster, but I have much more work to verify it, that it actually works because it's 90% accurate or 80% accurate. I cannot fully trust it.
Yeah,
And that may be even more frustrating because it's much harder for me to validate code that I never wrote.
exactly.
Someone else wrote, and it's pile of code, not just even the incremental work that I've done.
Yeah,
Uh, so let's talk about the assisted versus autonomous on that regard, and what is the difference, and how much are we expecting from just this bolt-on agent running on observability, not to run into this blind spot that we've talked about before. And second, be able to be 100% accurate. And the third point is the cost aspect, right? We still have to collect everything all the time, 24 by 7, to even have the agent. So the agent doesn't really addresses that collection thing. So
yeah,
let's talk about the accuracy thing, because I think that's something that a lot of people are missing. Because if you go to that agent, ask questions, it will give intelligent questions, but it will be very hard for you to know that it's only going to be 90% accuracy until you actually hit the point where it's wrong.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then and we're talking about systems that are mission critical, right? We're not talking about the ChatGPT where you're asking questions, it doesn't answer the right, and you're asking another questions, and you have a way to deal with it. This is a mission critical system. The impact of an error, as we discussed before, downtime of a system or things of that like, have a direct impact on the company bottom line
yeah.
and the
No,
company experience and the user experience and the perception of the company and the brand of the company and all those type of things comes with that. So accuracy is going to be super critical.
yeah, 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 100% correct. And at the same time, I know that humans can make mistakes. There are times where humans run red lights and things like that. But there is, there's trainings that we need to do to improve. So it's super important, especially for mission critical systems, that we observe. And then when it doesn't meet that 100%, when it's that 1 out of 10 that it fails, correct it. Help it to understand the parameters that were around it, that caused it to fail, right? And then continuously to train it. Again, to your example with Claude Code, I'm writing code, and it you have to the right prompts are important. The right amount of data that are is important to so they can really understand the parameters in which you're trying to do. Removing any assumptions. So initially we have to iterate in terms of like building its accuracy and kind of watch it. I still would not get to the point where for mission critical systems where it's completely hands off for humans, and that's just me.
Sure. Yeah.
We still kind of want, and again, we can reduce the amount of humans that are needed, because it's doing more work. But I still feel like that there has to be kind of kind of a human manager in the picture to verify that hey, we're not hallucinating, we're not making errors and adjusting those over time. So I think we can get there in terms of that. I'm optimistic about the 100%, especially if they're repeatable tasks that can happen.
Yep.
Again, there may be other variables that come into play.
How much of the tasks that SRE are doing are repeatable? How much are, like real complex problem from like a day job kind of experience?
I would say, and this is just again Joe Crawford's opinion, I would say about 80% of the task, and I'm being conservative about that, are repeatable. I mean,
Exactly.
when you have a system, right, and the system has a certain function, right? There's an optimal way that this system should function, right? And so keeping within those parameters should be kind of it's a pretty pretty consistent kind of task, right?
Exactly. And also I think touch on what is the actual remediation action that an SRE can do. Because I don't think that you fix a bug in production, right?
Yeah,
You usually try to bring the system up. Uh, I use the human health kind of analogy where I'm saying, like when you have a fever, first thing that you're doing is taking an Advil, right? You don't go to a doctor. Same thing here. I think an SRE cannot go and understand what type of query a developer just introduced, maybe forgot an index or something on the database, and that now results in low latency, also high latency issue. He will not be able to understand that part.
great.
So his remediation action is also kind of limited to rollback, to increase capacity, kind of sizing exercises, restart, those type of actions that are also uh, the thing that at the end of the day are the remediation that when we talk about SRE, there's a difference between remediation action to resolution of a
Yeah,
bug of a problem. Those are
yes.
two distinct different things. Can you touch on that from your experience?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. In my years of working in data center, again, going back to that metric of MTTR, our goal was to remediate as soon as possible, right? To get the customers
Exactly.
back on track. And so again, if that means rolling back, even whenever we had a change control, we always had a backout plan. We couldn't implement a change without a backout plan, right? So that the developers and the team had to have a way to fall back. So remediation was huge. It didn't matter about the resolution at the time. You figure that resolution out later on. Try to collect as much information as you can while the problem is happening, and then just you got to roll back, as soon as possible. So again, that could be an automated, function. But at the end of the day, you don't want to get to the point where you're masking problems or you're putting, duct tape and string on a problem and never really getting to the root cause. Going back to the human analogy, right? I could put a Band-Aid on a wound or whatever, but if there's a splinter in there, or if there's something else that's inside there that's causing even more infection that's going to get worse. Ultimately, that Band-Aid is not going to help. It will stop the bleeding,
Yep.
maybe, or prevent it, but I need to get to that root cause and resolve that problem. And so, with automation, again, if the mindset is to remediate, to reduce the MTTR really fast, we have to make sure that we also include the resolution part as well. They have to go
Right.
hand in hand.
And just touching on that, the important part is that when you, let's say, decide to do a rollback, there has to
Mhm.
be some sort of a context that you hand over that
Yeah,
that rollback with, so that someone would be able to investigate and actually get to the resolution. So it's not just, oh, let's do rollback, and therefore my job is easier. I'm just clicking a rollback button every time that I see a problem, and I'm done. No, you have to give context before you actually do rollback, because then I lose the context of the problem and I won't be able to even know what is the problem.
exactly.
And that's what makes it trickier, much harder to deal with. Um, Now, to kind of closing on that new SRE world
Mhm.
within the context of AI and what can be automated, what's not. I'll summarize a couple of things that we discussed. First of all, we said there are 80% of tasks that are repeatable. Those should be easy to address with AI, or say relatively easy to address. The set of actions that when we talk about remediation in the context of AI SRE is also limited actions. We're not talking about fixing bugs in production. We're talking about uh, basically rolling back, sizing, capacity, all those type of things that are more finite type of action that you could do in production.
Right.
And but the trick part is to do it with context so that there's going to be a quick handover between the actual SREs and the developers that now needs to get this task and fix the problem and then get it back into production. The the other point that I think we're kind of touching on the developer versus SRE in that case, we also have the opportunity to break that silo, right? So that
Mhm.
as part of the agent that will now, in the context of AI, observing the problem, he can also look at the developer pipeline
Mm,
and kind of get access to those tools and understand who is the developer who pushed the last change, what was the nature of that change, and again be much more actionable on the context that you could actually provide. But the way I see it is that in many cases, a lot of the bolt-on agents are not thinking in those kind of terms, at least not now, and maybe they will in a second. And most critically, what I found is that to really make sure that you resolve well and connect well, you need to understand the customer topology and application and dependencies, and not just, I would say, as an afterthought, like you collecting a lot of data, then you try to triage it in such a way that you understand it as an afterthought. You start to build the connect the dots and literally speaking, and try to understand the big picture.
mm,
You need to understand it up early, like before you even start the investigation. You need to have a very clear picture, an accurate picture of the topology of the customer environment to actually understand that. And I think, in my view at least, that's how the new kind of autonomous SRE world would look like. Now, back to the RAM, the real user management type of experience. One of the territory that I don't think people are thinking about, and that's kind of touching on your current Glassbox experience, is that the two worlds are now becoming also same thing that I just said about developers and SREs. I think is happening also between the front end guys and the back end guys, right? And and we have an opportunity to actually look at that more holistically right now.
right.
Tell me, being in both worlds, I think that would be kind of a very good closing kind of future looking view. Knowing both worlds, you've been a couple of years in the, let's say, monitoring servers, and now you've been 8 years monitoring humans.
Yeah.
How do you see that kind of view?
So my philosophy is looking at things from the view of the user, right? The user sees our service as a black box. You know, they come in, they want to do a task, and then they want to get out and go on with the rest of their lives, right? So it looks at it as a black box. So if our view is from the user and making sure that user has a good experience and making sure that that user has a frictionless experience, it's imperative for everyone within that black box to work together to make sure that that
Yeah.
service is seamless for that user. Okay, so that means the front end and the back end, they are tied together at the hip to make sure. And again, if you don't look at it from the perspective of the user and making sure that you have a passion for customer experience and great customer experience, and you're looking at it just from your silo, it doesn't work, right? Because then the blame or the responsibility is pushed on the other guy. Oh, it's the back end's problem, or it's the front end's
Mhm.
problem. And then at the end of the day, this user is saying, "I don't care. I just want to buy my tennis shoes, or I want to complete a transaction in my bank account." You know, so it's important from a company standpoint to have that mindset of like we need to make sure that the user is experiencing having a great experience. So my philosophy when I was managing enterprise monitoring, I would have the RUM And then also end user monitoring. I have scripts that will monitor and go through certain simulations, but I also look at things from the real user monitoring perspective to monitor the behaviors, the interactions, the experience of the user, and that helps me to prioritize the failures and the issues downstream. So if the user is having a slow response, doing a transaction, trace that transaction down to wherever the root cause is. Let's start addressing that. And again, that requires both front end and back end to work together. And seeing this as a whole, as opposed to the individual parts. And if you look at, because if people can say, "Hey, my part is good," it's just your part is bad.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you lose customers. You lose customers, you lose revenue. You lose revenue, you lose jobs. That's kind of how I look at it. Hopefully that helps.
Perfect. I think that would be a very good closing section for the discussion itself. Joe, thank you very, very much. I think we touched quite a ground here on
Thank you.
both the experience, I would say traditional kind of experience of how autonomous SRE works, what is a RAM kind of user experience kind of world from your experience in Glassbox. And I think you bring an immense knowledge of both the two fields, but also how customers are viewing it, how the actual operation kind of thing. So you kind of have this 360-degree kind of view, which I think is very unique. So really, really thank you for joining us and sharing your experience in that kind of world. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you so much, Natty. Thank you.